Whenever you're ready.
Hey all, welcome back to another episode of Two or Three Gathered. I am your co-host Caleb. This is my co-host Jared, and we're joined by a good friend of the podcast, Andrew. Two or Three Gathered is a series of conversations with Christian brothers and sisters, considering their efforts and contributions to the kingdom vocationally, their stories and their testimonies of God's sovereignty and grace, and an opportunity to tackle the relevant issues the church faces in the 21st century.
In this, we seek to equip the saints by networking within the body, starting the conversation around taboo subjects, and seeking to develop unity across Christian denominations and traditions by starting conversations on these worthy topics.
We want to educate the wider body of Christ by asking these experts and people of wisdom across multiple fields the hot-button questions and sophisticated questions that we believe there are answers for in Christ's church, but not necessarily answers to.
And it is our heart that Christ himself would be in our midst as we converse about things we believe he himself is very interested in.
Welcome, twos and threes. Thank you for gathering with us.
Jared put you up to that?
Yes, and you're very welcome.
Hey, where'd that come from, Andy? That was just so inspired, what you just said.
Oh, I just felt it, mate.
I feel like
That's right. I know where Jared lives now.
I feel like it's catching. Like, do you, Andy? Like, I feel like our fan base
feels like it.
Yeah, I think so.
Remember, Jared, I have, sorry, I'm mixing words. I have gang connections.
This is New Zealand. Who doesn't?
That's
I used
so
to
valid.
work in Paris, so yeah.
See the death theory just gave? Man.
I'll be well behaved now.
Yeah. Hey man, good to see you. Hey men, good to see you. What a pleasure to have us on. Today, I thought I'd bring this topic for us to discuss of movies that messed us up. That's the more censored version of the the brief I gave to my two dear mates here. But I also thought it might be appropriate just actually at this point to say a little bit of what we have covered and what we are planning to cover coming up. Obviously, we had the conversations where we actually interviewed each other, Caleb. Yeah, I thought you pretty good guest. Good way to actually us to learn the format as well, I thought. We had the opportunity to actually talk about soteriology in terms of Kanye West and Todd White. Kanye West, I mean, he doesn't need to really be introduced. Todd White is the person of, say, not Finger of God, not Furious Love, but Father of Lights fame and Holy Ghost fame. He starred in those films. He's the dreadlocked pastor from the States who famously was an atheist, got shot at. He kind of came to faith in kind of a radical way. And we wanted to talk on the back of his recent message where he said, I have not been preaching the full gospel and I now repent. We wanted to talk about actually what that looks like in church culture and Christian culture around someone in the public eye, or at least the Christian culture public eye, and what we typically do with that. And I thought our conversation was pretty good around that topic. Would you say anything on that, Caleb? Or
Yeah, I think it was a well-covered topic, I think, which is a light way of putting that it was quite long.
Yeah.
But no, I quite enjoyed it. It covered quite a few topics that I'm very passionate and interested about. So yeah, I really enjoyed that part of it.
Like saying, oh, it had a lot of scope and a lot of range is also another way of saying it was very long as well. Yeah, Andy, that's the thing we're finding we want to work on at the moment, just our length of our podcasts.
I was going to mention the phrase extremely thorough.
And you, having listened to, like maybe 10 minutes of each of our podcasts, you would say those 10 minutes were each extremely thorough, right?
Well, I'm currently about an hour and 10 minutes through one of them, but
Oh,
Which one?
It was the it was the cannabis, and yeah. I thought I'd start on the hard one.
I think that's the one, that and the euthanasia are the most viewed.
I mean, which is a
I
good
think that one is both of them, but it was focusing mostly on cannabis so far.
I mean,
Maybe
which is
it
a
gets
good,
to the other part towards the end. Sorry,
yeah,
go
yeah.
on.
No, sorry, apologies. Like, which is a good segue to like the fact that actually those were two other podcasts that we covered, just looking at these upcoming bills before the election results were announced. We had two referendums facing the New Zealand. One was the non-binding referendum on cannabis and the binding referendum on the proposed euthanasia bill, which of course we now have the results. I was saying to Caleb recently how with the euthanasia bill in particular, I was disappointed, but both not surprised by the result and surprised by the result. Not surprised that actually I did think a number of people in New Zealand would vote that way, but I was surprised as high as, I think it was like 33.7% actually voted no on the end of life bill, and that was higher than I would have expected. Yeah. Whereas the cannabis one, both Caleb and I kind of predicted that would be quite divisive anyway, and it was kind of like a who knows what will be the result of that, right?
Yeah,
it was
that really could have gone either way.
Yeah. What were you going to say, Caleb?
I was just saying it was pretty split down the middle when it came to the cannabis one, or maybe it was spliff down the middle.
There's been a no, don't apologize.
Wow.
Well, there's been conversation about a repeal as well. I don't know if that will actually eventuate with anything, right?
For the cannabis?
Yeah, with the cannabis in particular. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So what may potentially happen? I've seen speculation around the place that there may be a similar but different and amended bill put forth to Parliament because the vote wasn't binding. It'd just be silly for Parliament to put this bill forward, but with the amount of support that was behind it, it wouldn't be silly for them to propose another altered bill.
I don't think that's invalid. No, what were we going to say?
I was just going to say, given how the first one went, I'd actually expect there to be more people coming out of the woodwork to vote no if there was a second one. I almost got the impression with the first round that people who didn't necessarily want it just didn't bother voting because they didn't think the amount of people that did want it would show up.
I think also potentially on the inverse of that, a lot of youth votes quite often don't turn out, and a lot of younger people did want it to go through. But I think there was a greater youth turnout with this election, as far as I'm aware, than historically has been.
Which is why, they want to spend the next, say, 4 years before a revised version of the bill comes up again, really indoctrinating the youth and getting them to vote a particular way. They come to voting age. Yeah, I'm going to vote this way now. Yeah,
they're not going to be able to vote.
Rather than offering full and thorough education so that people can make a informed decision.
Yeah,
right off the bat, but that's okay.
Well, I think that was actually part of our motive. Well, I mean, I don't think that was part of our motive with actually doing the two casts. We felt like there was a lot of misinformation and conversation around both of these bills, and we wanted to, humbly and acknowledging limitations, say like, hey, here's a little bit of research we've pulled together. Hopefully, this informs how you vote. And I think it served that function, even though maybe the reach wasn't as high. Yeah, and I'm glad you go on.
It seemed that there was at least intention to be unbiased and present valid arguments. So I thought it was more an educational piece from how I received it. I think to that end you guys did really well.
Thank you.
Bless you, bro. You can come back.
He's got my seal.
Yeah. We obviously had the phenomenal Christine Walton on and covered a whole range of topics, such as women in church leadership, ethics in online communities, human trafficking and like pornography and the stigmas around it, the taboos around it, but as well as the abuses in our current culture. Like, she's a bit of a heavyweight. Like, I just really enjoyed having her on, just her wealth of intellect and insight, but just super engaging to talk to, super accessible as well. Like, I don't feel like she talks in dense, flowery language as a master's of theology, very engaging. And we plan to actually have her on to actually come back and talk about her testimony, right, Caleb?
Yeah, we do, and hopefully some other things here and there. But yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to having her back as a guest.
So coming up, we have a couple of things that are in the works and possible. Two things that we know are confirmed is we have a colleague of mine, the beautiful Vanessa Gatman, who has a master's in education around, particularly around the teaching of health. She started a charitable trust called You Are on the back of her own kind of efforts and the back of her own inspiration with a team of like-minded individuals, which seeks to actually affirm young women of middle school and high school ages in their femininity, their identity, their self-worth. Basically, they do like 3-day program over the holidays where they do a lot of workshops and a lot of like talking on body issues and self-worth, like powerful, amazing stuff. She's written a book. I'm going to forget the title. Hopefully, Caleb, do you have it next to you?
Sorry, I have it down here. I quit hating my body so she could love herself.
Yes, that's the one. Plug. So we look forward to having her. I just find her a really inspiring individual. Think Christian motivational speaker, but with depth and with insight and with wisdom to back it up. She'll be a real joy to have on, as well as we have the privilege of having on the perhaps well-known in the New Zealand context, Ashley Church. He features sometimes on the breakfast show. He as a commentator on like social issues, but mostly on housing issues and housing concerns as a former CEO of the Property Institute of New Zealand. He also has a role now as a figurehead for the Israel Institute of New Zealand, which seeks to address anti-Semitic bias in the media. And I should know him quite well because he's my dad. So we look forward to having him on. Yeah, if I didn't, right? As well as planning. Go on. Sorry.
Plug.
Yeah, definitely. But he also... he has a wealth of experience in talking in a whole bunch of media forums and formats. He should be a very engaging person to have on. And we also plan, like with Christine, to actually, after introducing him to our fan base, actually have him on for a couple of other topics in the near future. But in terms of the topic that I was wanting to discuss today, kind of to riff on with you guys, we wanted to talk about this idea of movies that messed us up. Basically movies that just kind of expanded our thinking, had a wide reception, made a lot of people think differently on a whole range of different topics. And who better to have that conversation with than my beautiful co-host, of course, but also the wonderful Andrew. Thanks for coming on, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
Andrew, I actually know by association, not myself, who's been an acquaintance by my dear brother-in-law, who, when they actually studied together at, I believe the name was Faith Bible College in Tauranga, is that right?
That's the one, yeah.
Yeah. And what was your experience like there when you're actually on in that campus and on going through that experience?
Very different to what I would have expected and probably what I would experience now. At the time, I was pre-20, so I would say that I really found, somewhat of a family. And when you're immersed in a place that's so focused on God and learnings and teachings about it, about all of that, you really that's all you focus on. That's the majority of what you focus on and talk about for the 2 years that I was there. And because I was so young, I hadn't had the last 10 years of life experience that I had back then. So I imagine going through that now would be quite a different experience. But yeah, to answer your question, illuminating, stretching, and growing at the time.
Love that. Great answer, man. I think Caleb and I could both attest to that experience of having gone to Laidlaw, and that kind of experience for us. Because it's like a university, generally we would hope that to be that experience, right? But especially being in an institution that is by its nature and by its profession, you know, ecumenical, Christian, and seeking to actually develop theological thinking with regards to a whole range of disciplines, right? But yeah, we thought Andrew, whenever I've actually run into him and actually had the pleasure of having his company, he's a great guy, very approachable, very gregarious, very likable, very easy to talk to, but also there's depth there. Yeah, man, I'll keep, blowing hot air up your butt. No, like, honestly.
Please stop.
Like, I find you're someone with a bit of insight and a bit of depth. And so our thinking was actually to have with a couple of people who we call friends of the cast, one of our twos or threes, actually have basically have you talk about this topic with us and like just actually riff a little bit and see where we actually go with what we have to discuss.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess I'll be starting us off. I've brought two movies to the plate, one of which is based off a short story. And I guess I'll start with that one. The movie is called Predestination. It was made in 2014. And it was based off a short story. I can't remember the name of the author. The short story was called All You Zombies.
Heinlein, I think, was the name, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I was introduced to the story at first quite a few years ago when I was listening to a Chuck Missler series on called Beyond Space-Time. He was talking about a lot of different theories and phenomena within the world of dimensional mathematics and physics, and how we understand dimensions within a basic understanding, and also how advanced physics and mathematics has gone to reflect what thinkers and philosophers and theologists have actually theorized centuries, even millennia ago, in commentaries on the Bible, or even the authors of the Bible may have been hinting toward. And in this, he's talking about different ideas about time, the fourth dimension, and with that comes talk of time travel. And he brings up paradoxes and uses the story of All You Zombies as an example of ultimate paradoxes, because the story is just built upon that. Now, just as a side note for editing out, I'm assuming we're doing spoilers for all of these stories.
Oh, mate, like I'll say without actually editing it out. I mean, the film came out in 2014, so if you haven't seen it now, like, yeah. I apologize, guys. Yeah. Skip ahead to insert this time here, and you will not have it spoiled for you.
Basically the whole video, I guess. For those of you watching who don't want spoilers for any of these stories or films, skip ahead to a time that will be marked on the screen, or we'll figure out something else later in post. In the meantime, here comes some spoilers. Predestination, or All You Zombies, is a story as told from the perspective of a bartender. Now, this bartender has a very bedraggled, somber man, kind of scruffy man, come into his bar and sit down and order a drink or two and says, leave the bottle, and obviously not in the best mood. So they get talking. This patron is a writer and refers to himself as the Unmarried Mother, and that's his pen name. He often wrote stories from the perspective of a woman. Now, the Unmarried Mother claims that he really understands the woman's perspective in life, and has a very unique grasp on that perspective, and describes and tells his own story to the bartender. Now, it turns out this unmarried mother was born, was taken to an orphanage as a newborn, but as a newborn baby girl. Now, this girl was raised under the name Jane because it was, I think it was hinted at as a Jane Doe kind of thing. Jane was brought up as something of a misfit, didn't really go along with the status quo, and Jane was quite intelligent and quite strong. Not super unattractive, but not super pretty either. And Jane wanted to join what was called a space force, but only men in this time and in the story were able to become astronauts. Women were able to serve in an alternative capacity, however. But this later falls through due to medical complications unbeknownst to Jane. Jane later meets a drifter who appears to be quite rich, spends a night with said drifter, and then the drifter disappears.
Presumably quite handsome as well, right?
Yes, quite handsome one. Now, she never hears from this drifter again, but the drifter left behind a baby for Jane. Jane is now pregnant. When the time comes for her to give birth, she, like I say, was an orphan, raised in an orphanage, had no family, so was alone at the time of delivery, and she passes out, wakes up, says that she had a cesarean. It's told that she had a cesarean, and is told, your baby's fine, but in the meantime, we discovered that you have both sets of male and female organs. There was a severe bleed with the female organs. We had to remove them, and the male organs are immature and they will have to grow. We will put you on a course of hormone therapy and you will become a man. Jane becomes a man. Jane becomes a writer and is now in this bar. Now the bartender says, and Jane is quite angry with this drifter who had left her with the baby, which I should also say was stolen from her at the hospital. Some random man came in and stole the baby. My apologies for how long this is taking, but this story is insane.
Are you following so far, Andy? Yeah.
Cool.
Bullet points. I mean, girl who's orphan, grows up, has baby by drifter, finds out she's actually, is a man, talking to a guy in a bar, angry at the guy who's actually abducted her baby. That follows, right? Like, Yeah, keep
now,
going.
now the bartender says, "What if I could bring you to this man? What if I could put him before you? Would you kill him?" Jane says, "Oh, of course. But how would you know?" And bartender slowly reveals he's a time agent. He's a time traveler, and he can take her to the moment that she met this drifter. Now, keep in mind, Jane is now a man and looks very different from what she did before. Now, Jane is trying to find this man and bumps into her previous self. Jane falls in love with herself and spends the evening with the past Jane and leaves,
Oh,
realizing what she or he has done. And Jane realizes, oh my gosh, I'm the drifter. The bartender had given him money, which is what the whole money thing was about. But then it gets even worse. As Jane's having her night with herself, the bartender goes off and completes another secret mission in relation to his time agency, but then also goes back to the date of Jane's birth, steals the baby, takes it to an orphanage. That's not all. We find out later that, so bear in mind, this baby, sorry, I'll go back. I'll start that point again. While Jane is having this night with herself, the bartender is completing a secret mission for the time agency. Now, part of what this bartender decides to do on the side of his secret mission is go back in time to the day that Jane gave birth to her baby, steal it from a hospital, take it back in time to supposedly the time that Jane was born, and drop it off to an orphanage. So this baby is fathered by a mother and father who are the same person, but it turns out that this baby is the mother and the father. Then the bartender later reveals that he himself is Jane. Just had facial reconstructive surgery. So basically, this person is their own family tree, has no ancestors, has kind of parents, but they are their parents. There are jokes kind of hinted throughout the film and the story. You know, there's a jukebox playing the song "I'm My Own Grandpa." And then the movie adds another twist with another character that wasn't in the short story, but that one's quite interesting. I won't give that away for anyone who wants to watch the movie.
Oh, that's like one of the best bits.
I know, exactly. That's why I don't want to give that one away.
You should.
But honestly, this movie, well, I actually only recently watched the movie. It's the story that has for a long time just had me thinking, what the heck? Because it's a multitude of paradoxes that just makes us question time and space and matter just in its entirety, and it can be explained away as nonsense when you learn about the dimension of time through the lens of mathematics and physics. I, however, do not have that grasp or comprehension of mathematics and physics, so I'm just sitting here just, that's weird. So this is a story that has for a long time really sat with me as a strange one, and
But like
Yeah, really baffles me.
like on the surface, it's not possible though, right? Like you can't give birth to yourself, like, and then relocate yourself, and like, I think like the paradox can't resolve itself as a result.
Mm.
Is that your
But
take
let's
on it?
say in a universe in which the biology is feasible,
Yes.
to have both male and female working reproductive organs, and it is also possible to have linear time travel, which we now know as is explained in the Beyond Space-Time series by Chuck Missler, and many other much more in-depth studies from
Such as Back to the Future.
physics and time. Yeah, show us that time is not linear.
Yes. Yeah.
But should it be linear, and time travel were possible, this is solvable, I guess, but it's kind of playing a question of, were time linear? Is fate a thing? Were they constantly fated to repeat the same actions, especially when they come into contact with oneself and realize, oh, I'm about to seduce myself and father my child and be angry at myself.
And especially based on that spoiler, which you won't reveal, but
No, yeah, definitely, yeah.
That's arguably the best.
Definitely, I did see it coming though.
Did you?
I'm very happy with myself that I saw that one coming. I never see twists coming, but
I'm gonna have to watch this, I think.
Yeah, I should. Okay, I will potentially edit this out. Andrew, would you like me to actually say what the ending is, or would you prefer to actually watch it?
I honestly don't mind spoilers. Go for it.
Caleb, do you want to? Or
so it turns out that there's this bomber that they call the Fizzler bomber. I think that's what they called it, the Fizzler bomber. And that's part of the secret mission that this time agent has been working on, trying to stop this large explosion from happening that wipes out thousands and thousands of people, that kills about 10,000 people in New York, thereabouts. And it turns out that not only is the bartender, the baby, the father, and the mother the same person, but so is the bomber. The bartender / time agent is due to finish his tenure as a time agent, and his time machine will stop working, but there's a failure with it, and it continues to work. And he runs into his older self and realizes he is the bomber and kills himself. Not to his own head, but shoots his future self, driving himself insane, forcing himself to rationalize bombings and later become the very person that he never wanted to be and wanted to stop.
See, wow. Can I speak to that as well, bro? Like, yeah, like, because I watched this again recently with Steph on the back of Caleb shared the story. It's like, I'm sure I've seen this before. I'm sure I've read this before. And it's like, it's Predestination. Oh my gosh. It's got like Ethan Hawke, who he was in like First Reformed and like, yeah, he's like, Training Day. That's right. With Denzel Washington. And Sarah Snook, who's like an Australian actor. She was like in the Steve Jobs film with is that Michael Fassbender? Is that his name?
I think that was him.
Yes. But yeah, basically like there's this kind of lead up the fact that like, you know, doing multiple jumps within short succession actually kind of screws up your mind. It kind of leads you to psychosis. It has like physical effects on your body. So you're kind of already kind of in a stage of psychosis, and the way he's devoted to actually hunting down this guy, like he's spending the majority of his career and amongst doing other missions, like saying, I must find the fizzle bomber. This guy's going to kill thousands, and it's just a fixed event that can't be changed. I have to change it. No wonder that he finds it so hard to actually find himself if he's constantly evading himself as well. Like, it would make sense that he would be able to do that, right? But he gets to this point where he's finally faced with the person who's like been one of his sole reasons for existence as a time agent, and then he finds out that he is that person. And I was thinking about the ending of that recently, like, okay, because the fizzle bomber's talking to them and they have a long dialogue, and he's saying, like, you know, look, the thing you have to do differently is you have to not kill me. You have to find it in your heart to love me and not shoot me, because like that's like, if you kill me, you become me. And he's like, I will never become you, and he does shoot him. And I was thinking, like, why does he then still fulfill it? But then I guess I kind of thought in terms of paradoxes, if he doesn't then do the bombing, like a whole lot of things that actually led up to that point get undone in the time stream, like in his own kind of story. Like, if he actually doesn't fulfill that, his whole motivation for, you know, snatching the baby and like doing that to himself and impregnating himself and like all those things get undone if the fizzle bomber isn't in the background, because it's been this driving force about why he has done all these things. So to actually complete his own story arc and his own motivations for himself, he has to actually fulfill that motivation for himself. So I kind of thought, like, maybe that's the basis to why he actually still does it, because the justification that the fizzle bomber gives to younger version of himself is like, no, by killing thousands I've actually saved a whole lot more. Like, there's events that I've actually been able to study, and I've seen the cause and effect relationships, like these people were a necessary sacrifice to save others. Yeah, like, which I think just like blew my mind on the back of that. Was that your takeaway, Caleb, or?
Yeah, definitely. I think that added another layer to it that the story didn't have originally. That the original story is a short, I think 9-10 page story, so it's not super long, but it's always been a definitely a mind blow kind of story. But yeah, it's I think that's a very, I guess I would agree with that takeaway of it. Yeah.
Do you think go on, Andrew, sorry.
Oh, just quickly. It raises a few of my initial thoughts would be that with anything, if you pull the thread enough, eventually the jersey will unravel, right? So it's explainable with rational logic to a point. There is, however, a point that you will reach that it does become irrational. Like, there's a specific point you'll get to where you're like, okay, this little thing here makes the rest of it not make sense. However, with this, and there's one other point I want to bring up at the end, but just real quickly with this.
Longly, don't quickly.
The initial point could be that Jane was born normally and naturally, and then there really was somebody who stole Jane and delivered to an orphanage. That baby Jane then grew up, met the drifter, got pregnant, gave birth, and then ended in the bar and all that sort of stuff. And at that point, there was an intervention where the alternate Jane comes in and replaces what would have normally been the set course of event, thus causing the paradox to have a rational beginning, and then at this point becoming cyclic.
Right.
Take that then a step further, where this interaction in the bar, I haven't seen the movie, mind you, this interaction in the bar provokes Jane, or now Joe, I'm assuming. What are they?
Yes.
Is there a name change?
Joe, yeah, I think she.
Joe,
yeah.
Joe or John or something.
Yeah.
Male Jane then proceeds on with life, becomes a time agent, becomes the bomber, and all that sort of stuff, and that is the end of that version of Jane. In the meantime, there's a few other versions that come into it and come out of it, but so it's explainable through logic.
And so you're appealing to like modal universes there, like multiple universes in different.
Yeah, exactly.
timelines.
So
okay.
Yeah, if the universe is weirder and vaster than we can currently understand or perceive, and these other possibilities are there, I doubt it, but if they are, then it's at the very least explainable with fictitious logic. Um, the ending, what you've described with the bombing part of it, it's a theme that's come up in several movies. I'm actually reminded of a movie called Watchmen, if you've seen that, where the ending of the movie is the big bad manipulating Dr. Manhattan and all that sort of stuff and setting off bombs around the world under the guise of, we'll unite the world, we'll bring peace essentially by these sacrifices. Now, it's the age-old question of how much evil is too evil before it's irredeemable, right? So again, a logical and rational argument could be made, well, yeah, there was world peace. If they didn't do that, the world would have ended in nuclear holocaust, etc., etc., etc. Now, my stance on it is probably a little bit more black and white in that I would say any evil is too evil. If you do even one heinous evil act, you're committing evil, regardless of how you explain it away. The consequences after that, though, is where it becomes a bit grey, because if you've then short-stepped and you've not done something when you could have, regardless of how evil that was, are you responsible for the greater evil? That's a question I really don't want to ask myself.
I guess that reminds me of the ethical conundrum of the United States decision to drop nuclear warheads on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A lot of people look at that as just a show of power and a show of technology, and I guess saying we can win this war if you really push us, which in part it was. But if you also look at it historically, and if you look at what was happening in Japan, these were people who were entirely devoted to their emperor, and men, women, and children were willing to take up arms. Now, Hiroshima and or Nagasaki were very much industrial cities that were dedicated to building armor, weaponry. That was very vital to the Japanese forces. And what that did was it put a stop to multiple fronts. It scared the Japanese people away from sacrificing their own lives. It was the cost of thousands of lives as opposed to tens of or hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides of the battle. And it was a calculated decision saying, well, we've halted their military production and therefore they can't keep on fighting and we don't need to sacrifice more troops. So it's a very big ethical conundrum of did the United States do the right thing by putting an end to that part of the war by dropping nuclear warheads. Some would argue yes, some would say no. A lot say it's a grey area.
It's kind of like the old, because I think there's the difference between, say, tyrannical fascist good and necessary evil, right? Like there seems to be a real fixation in current films with the anti-hero as opposed to the hero. Like I think that's part of the reason like Thanos in MCU is actually found kind of compelling, because he's like he's trying to do good. Like I'm reminded of like the D&D grid, like has got like everything from lawful good to chaotic evil, right? Like you're trying to actually bring balance by actually do that. I kind of go in a different direction based on that film though, right? Like let's say time actually as a linear thing doesn't exist. Like it does exist in terms of the measurable. We can see that the planets orbit the sun within a certain passing of time, but it's not something that can kind of be entered in and out of. It's more kind of like the measure of distance over space by observable like points of difference in terms of time. But if time itself doesn't actually exist as something that can kind of be entered into, that means that the one reality that's actually lived is this reality. which then puts more impetus on actually the actions we take and the choices we make are that much more significant because there isn't multiple universes or multiple realities to which to compare it to. I mean, that's one argument I've heard around this. Like, do either of you have thoughts around that?
I'm not a physicist. Like, as Caleb said, I have a, well, no, he's not a physicist also, as he said, end of that part. Now,
Yeah.
I, again, I can pull strings on logic. There has been evidence indicating that at least the perceived passing of time can be experienced differently by different observers. That was a weird sentence.
No, it makes sense.
Yeah, so they have, they've done like chronological testing in that they've got, you know, 2 clocks set the same, sent one out of space, come back, and then they'll be like a few seconds apart. Now, while it's not vast, it's still something.
It's measurable.
So, yeah, it's measurable, yeah.
So you're saying that's objective as opposed to subjective at that point?
Yeah, when we have evidence that does indicate of a certain fact, it has to be perceived as everybody around it, regardless of their beliefs, they have to look at that clock and say, yeah, it's different.
Right.
So if you put that test under extreme stress and you push it to the limits, then you could be seeing difference of hours.
So,
similarly to, yeah, that's similar to how we have 2 atomic clocks in the world, one in Greenwich in the UK and one in, I think it's in Colorado in the States. And they are the most precise clocks we have available to us. But they are off by a small fraction of time. And as each year goes by, it's a small fraction of a second that they disperse. And the reason for that is the altitude at which they sit. The one in Colorado is at a higher altitude. Therefore, gravity is affecting it less. And it is the gravity that is affecting the passing of time. And again, I don't know exactly how that works. I've had it explained to me by people who really do understand the physics side of things, and I've looked into the mathematical side of things. It seems to make sense, but I cannot regurgitate it because I will not do it justice. So,
and nor can I.
Yeah, so we'll maybe put some links in the description of some stuff that we've found quite interesting around that, should anyone be interested in that.
I do see similar theological implications, though. Like, I mean, if you look at the potential that actually different, possibilities exist, that, different modal universes exist. I've actually heard William Lane Craig talk on this, and he actually says, as a fundamental first truth, or as a, like, I forget the exact term he uses, but like this idea of an essentially necessary truth, or a transcendently necessary truth. Say, a God has created all things. A creator has created all things. That is a transcendent first cause. Can't be the case for some universes and not the case for other universes. So that still implies a transcendent sense of morality, although humans try and grasp at what exactly that is and what that looks like. That still implies, right and wrong. That still implies, by extension, I would say, the ability to infer empirically the world around us, make subjective truth claims, make objective truth claims, and they have the possibility of being true. Like, if we didn't have a creator, then it's all ideas in a crapshoot. Basically, everything is relative. You can basically make up your ideas as much as you want. But if there is a transcendent creator outside the known universe, then suddenly you say something and it has the possibility of being true because there is a transcendent measure outside of the known universe that affirms that possibility. And so I kind of see, if there are modal universes, or if there is no conceivable construct of time, and this is the only lived reality, with the idea of a transcendent creator, there's still a similar ramification of our actions have consequences, what we do has meaning, we need to be intentional about the choices we make. That's how I kind of look at it. I think they both have similar theological ramifications. Andrew, what was the movie you wanted to talk about, or one of?
I'm thinking about bringing a fourth one in, actually, one that I haven't given any thought to. Just with the brief discussion that came up earlier of how much evil is too evil before it's irredeemable. Have either of you seen the movie Hacksaw Ridge?
Yes.
Great film.
You've both seen it?
Definitely my favorite World War II film.
Awesome. I had the other movies that I did have were Lord of the Rings from a different perspective, like not necessarily the classic theological take on it, just something else, more of a personal view on some stuff that's happened recently.
Because it's interesting with like J.R. Tolkien, like he even said like it's not supposed to be a Christian allegory. Like he was very explicit about that, right? But people make those comparisons all the time.
Even one of his sons did, I think.
Yeah, well, that's interesting in and of itself. Hey, like But sorry, Andy, you were going to say.
I might come back to Hacksaw Ridge a little bit later because I think we can probably all three have quite an in-depth discussion about that one. What's hit me recently with Lord of the Rings? My wife and I recently watched it on 4K because it just got re-released recently, and this has got to be about my 20th or 30th viewing of the trilogy at minimum. Like I usually watch it multiple times every year. I love it.
You're a bit of a fan, Andy, yeah.
Big time, yeah. Just don't talk about it with Tony. He'll always tell you that I fell asleep in the Two Towers. So with The Return of the King, Erica and I cried through the last hour of it this last time that we watched it. And as I said, I've seen it so many times before and I've never cried. And this led me to my first thought on this movie, is that a large concept for me is that different movies can have vastly different impact on you at different times of your life. So you could watch one movie here and then 10 years later and get an entirely different experience out of it. Lord of the Rings is that big one for me recently that we watched through recently. And the first part that really, well, actually what I'm going to talk about today is the journey that Sam and Frodo went through, right? To get the ring, take it to Mount Doom and destroy it, speaks of the absolute commitment that they had to each other, to the world, to their task, and the responsibility that they recognized that came with. Their persistence through everything that they went through, right? It was horrific, the stuff they went through. They fought a giant spider, right? I'm not going to go through and explain the entire plot of Lord of the Rings. It's 2020. If you've not seen it, you're really missing out. Go and watch it, everybody. The extended version, it's fantastic. But what really has stuck out to me is the persistence of the characters through tribulation, right? And we can draw many, many, many biblical parallels through just those words alone. And that was actually what I wanted to initiate the discussion on today, was the persistence through the trials to fulfill the end result, right? I mean, the first and most obvious standout for me here would be, Paul's statement, "I've run the race," right? And that for me is so important. I mean, I know that this is more a personal probably point to bring up here, but the only tattoo that I have is actually the word endure in Morse code, just because throughout my entire life the theme of persisting and enduring has it's been such a huge driving factor in my decision making, my journey, the events that have happened in my life, the things I've had to get through, right? Won't go into my full testimony here, but this is what I wanted to bring out. And I was just wondering with you two bros, how does that speak to you? I know that it's not obviously the biggest theme that we can draw from Lord of the Rings, but it's what spoke to me the most in the most recent viewing of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Now it's not as much of a movie that messed me up as much as Caleb's one is right now for me. I'm still trying to get over that one, bro.
Yeah.
But
So am I.
yeah, sweet. And I did bring two other movies as well, but I'll just stick with Lord of the Rings for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I quite like that. I've always I'm naughty. I still haven't read the books, but I have a close friend and my father have dictated to me all of the inaccuracies in the film that are not found in the books, etc. Things that they took out, whatever. But I've watched the films many a time.
Good man.
And I really thoroughly enjoy them. And yeah, I guess I would definitely say that I have seen that theme in that film of endurance, especially and commitment, especially Sam's commitment to the mission and to his good friend Frodo. It's always broken my heart, the scene where Sam is when they're on the stairs up the on their way on the edges of Mordor, and Gollum hatches his little plan to accuse Sam of eating all the lumnus bread, and that's a scene that brings tears to my eyes. Is just Sam kind of just the heartbreak.
The betrayal.
Moment Frodo says, "No, Sam, you go. You need to leave." Yet, even though that was the case, he was still committed to returning. And when he discovered the truth, obviously he returns and, goes to rescue Frodo and
shows real loyalty and love, hey?
Yeah, very much so. And they both on many occasions risk their own lives for each other. The entire fellowship do so. Some of them lay down their lives, and taking that to a theological comparison is no greater love than this, to lay down one's life for his friends.
Jesus' own words, hey?
Yeah, and
I had that one written down actually.
Yeah, and that's sorry if I stole that.
No.
Yeah, but yeah, that's something that I guess stands out to me.
Just clarifying, I'm sure Jesus doesn't mind us citing his words, 2,000 years after the fact. Like in an essay, make sure to give me credit,
John 15:13 then to
the Bible.
Yeah.
Caleb, that's also, I feel, really amplified when they're on Mount Doom and they've actually gone all the way there and they've just got a few steps to go. And there's the scene that always, well, in the most recent viewing, brought a tear to my eye, where he says, "I can't carry it for you," honoring his commitment to escort Frodo rather than like take over the quest. I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. And that is such a beautiful picture of commitment.
That gives me goosebumps. That's the scene that
right?
I'm like, oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I just, it was really blowing my mind just thinking about it. I know that I do know that what I'm bringing to the table today is a shallow scraping upon the surface of Lord of the Rings. Like, it's not a deep issue, but it's just one that was so impactful for me recently. And I really wanted to share it.
I think art is both like subjective and objective, right? Like in expression, like, people can actually have, the artist can have like a meaning of the text that they're intending, but it can also, and sometimes very explicitly, be about actually the perceived message that it embodies and actually takes on, and as it takes on a life of its own, like actually what it means to its audience. So I think that's also relevant as well, right? Like, I look at it two ways, right? Like, generally speaking, we're in a society where increasingly comfort is enshrined as like one of the most important virtues and one of the most important values. Like we live and die to actually live the most comfortable livelihood. And like it's infected the church with the likes of, say, the prosperity doctrine, right, and the prosperity gospel, where actually that's not the glimpse of actually discipleship that Jesus gives us. You know, if you are to follow me, it means taking up your cross and following after me. If your brother smacks you on the cheek, turn your other cheek and actually open yourself up to more abuse, essentially, right? And this isn't just like Jesus's words. This seems to be the consistent case within the biblical meta-narrative. I mean, you've got Jeremiah, you know, talking about the siege of Jerusalem and the likes of Lamentations and like his own prophetic journey over the book of his own name. You've got, you know, Psalm 88, called the darkest psalm in all of Scripture, right? Basically talking about how, you know, shall the dead proclaim your works and your glory, God? You know, basically you're leaving us for dead. You know, should we, you know, is that what you actually want? You want actually people to actually die under your hand, and that's actually what, are they the people that actually profess Imago Dei, profess your glory? Like it's almost like a heartfelt argument and conversation with God. So there's the general takeaway that actually, I think as long as we live in this world, this is the worst of heaven and the best of hell in this space, right? Like we don't see absolute depravity, but we certainly see total depravity for all you Calvinists out there. we see the world as not as bad as it could be a lot of the time, but it's certainly, there's a lot of instances of where separate from that relational dynamic with God, that relational interaction with God, what we were designed for, the absence of actually defining good and evil in the context of a relationship. We have people trying to grasp it, well, versions of good and evil for themselves. And so we have this kind of reality where one of those things is enshrined as, let's pursue comfort. But I think the Christian message is actually, take up your cross and follow me. Jesus entered into a world of suffering to actually show us how he wanted us to live, to show us that we were worth his suffering, that we were worth actually going that extra mile for, carrying us, you know, even though we can't carry it ourselves. And I think like, yeah, like there's really that invitation to actually, the Christian life means actually enduring, like the verse that jumped out for me was like Romans 5 verse 3-5. Not only so we glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So pneumatologically, there's a confirmation of, in the midst of suffering, ironically, that's sometimes when we feel closest to God. And that's what that verse is kind of giving us an attestation to, right? Like the presence of the Holy Spirit, his love is poured out to us in the midst of when we are being most like Jesus. We're enduring suffering as a way of actually showing the face of God, the God who actually said, I'll enter into this for you. I'll do this for you. Yeah, so like hard out, man, like not shallow at all. I feel like, you know, definitely an appeal to a greater Christian theme. I think that is kind of like generally, but also the personally of it as well for me. Like in terms of my life and my testimony, definitely lots of invitations to actually just be reminded again, well, this is not my final home, and I shouldn't be about actually trying to make this place my final resting place, or trying to make this life become as comfortable as it can be, or like kind of shake my fist at God, although I think that has its place and actually has a, God's gracious enough that he invites it. He wants us to be our sincere and true selves about how we feel. You know, the Psalms give lots of affirmation of that. Like it's okay to be ourselves and be how we truly feel and think with God. But I think also like not actually just staying at that place of like, you know, I'm going to hold God accountable for all the wrongs that happen in this world, because we've got so much greater awaiting us, is what I think should be the reminder. I don't know, kind of my thoughts on it.
If I may, would you mind?
Mm.
It sort of leads perfectly into what was going to be my final remark on the journey of Frodo and Sam. is that throughout the movies, like all three, their focus is really to, destroy the ring and restore, for lack of a better word, peace or safety, comfort, maybe, to the world, right? And they finally, at the end of it all, achieve that, and they're heading back. They're heading back to the Shire, and it isn't what he was working towards, even though he thought it was. So he gets back, and there's all the quotes, the famous ones, like, how can you pick up the threads of an old life? Because you simply can't. When you've gone through everything you have, and you've won the race, at the risk of being cheesy, but you've succeeded in your goal, and like what you were meant to do, you've done, and you finally return and you find what you thought you were working towards isn't the case, and yet there's, as you put it, even greater awaiting. So when he returns to the Shire, it's not happy days. That's not the end of it. It's actually another step beyond that, and that he's taken to the Undying Lands. Like he goes to a whole new place that he didn't even know was awaiting him. The goal is not often the final piece of the puzzle. That's when you can stand up and walk away from the table to what you're actually going to go do. And it was really just part of the journey that I hadn't considered before, to that degree. And that was what I really wanted to bring to the table.
Cool. I really like those, I guess, observations of the story. Because I guess I haven't considered it entirely in that regard before. But yeah, obviously there's like we mentioned earlier, there are those theological parallels that people place upon the story of Lord of the Rings often, but not quite in that regard have I really examined it. I think on that we could probably move to Jared.
Hey,
what was a film that you had that really gets you going?
Hi guys, I feel like, it's a kind of all beautiful and somber, and I'm going to take it to kind of like more of a darker turn, but here goes, right?
Do it.
One of the films that I remember, and I didn't watch it when I was like under the age of 10, I watched it probably in my teens, but I remember my siblings watching it, was Brad Pitt and Edward Norton's Fight Club. Love that film.
Here we go.
Yeah, man. In fact, like I have a story, like it's a school story, like where I had not seen the film. I was probably in about year 3 or 4, but I know other people in our school had seen the film. And so one of the things we actually started at lunch times was actually a fight club where we would actually make a ring of people in the field, and we were just watching other people scrapping. It's one of the distinct memories I have of like sitting outside the principal's office because I was involved in a fight club. But like, no, I remember that film, watching it, and that had a really distinct impression on me. Based on the novel, and I actually have read the book as well. I'm one of those, shameless fans, those geeky fanboys. It's like, the book's better than the movie, but I think this actually has some precedent here because they do a really good job of adapting the film into the book. The book into the film. But okay. The book does kind of actually just give a bit more depth and a bit more explanation. And you have that whenever you try to condense a book into like a more, edited, surmised, have to throw out certain arcs because it doesn't make sense. We can't do it justice within the timeline, within the time constraints. Like you'll often have that when you try to convert from one medium to that kind of more constrained medium. Anyway, regardless, this novel by the guy's name is Chuck Palahniuk. I'm sure I'm saying that incorrectly. But like, it just really messed with my head, especially because it was my first kind of, and I think a lot of people of our generation, our exposure to the idea of mental illness and split personalities. As a short summary of the film, and yep, spoiler alert, sorry, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to go ahead and do it. We have the character Edward Norton, who just kind of lives this kind of like Joe Schmo kind of life. He, lives in an apartment. He's a single bachelor, mid-20s, early 30-something. your average guy, Joe Blogg, in a lot of respects, kind of pursuing that capitalistic, American dream, like let's have this, the apartment with all the stuff and live the nice life, the life of comfort. And he meets this character who totally kind of makes him question his whole kind of actually method of living up until that point. Like, it's been about, the pursuit of happiness, but actually, what does that look like in terms of a society that actually doesn't actually, this stuff is meaningless. This whole, it's kind of like a front for kind of optimistic nihilism, I would say, in a lot of ways. Edward Norton meets Brad Pitt, and Brad Pitt actually ends up being the other version of Edward Norton's self. And it's kind of a reveal in the film because we're made to think like it's this other person, this other character who kind of entirely shows Edward Norton a better way of living, like a more uninhibited way of living. It kind of like shows this idea of like anarchy is the natural state from which man descends, like the natural state of men, and particularly men, because there's actually an appeal to actually what is true masculinity, this kind of dangerous, risky, kind of like edgy masculinity that's like, I'm going to do things like no matter what the risks are and what the consequences are in pursuit of a perceived better good or more tangible good. So what starts is basically is like a solidarity, like these two guys, or I guess you could say one guy, starting this fight club where basically just these guys beat the crap out of each other and wail on each other. It becomes this kind of this fellowship where guys actually can be men and like let out all the repression and all the frustrations of their daily lives because they're sick of, getting it from their boss or their wives or their friends or their colleagues, and like all the unfairness that life's thrown at them. They actually have this outlet, where they can come and just actually completely anonymously, not knowing these people outside of this context and pretending not to know each other outside of this context. In Fight Club, it's this kind of like this communion, this sacred encounter of actually via violence, we're going to be made free. Via violence, we're going to actually encounter our true selves, that more primordial version of man. And so what is interesting about the film and the book is that this fight club, this fraternity, develops into, well, we've actually got a lot of guys who actually feel in the same way, because Brad Pitt becomes this kind of magnanimous character, larger than life, because he's like, it's not just then about the actual fraternity, it's about we've got these people who feel disillusioned with what we've been told to grasp at and to go after. And, we've got this similarity of vision. Let's energize this, let's catalyze this, let's push this in a direction. And so they pursue this kind of anarchy, this desire to actually reset society. In the book, that the way they go about doing that, or plan to do that, is actually to bomb these major banks and to actually set the credit limit back to like ground zero. And actually, you can imagine like doing that with something like Wall Street, or like in America, or some kind of global economic institution that would have catastrophic like effects on actually what society would be. Especially back in those days, we probably have a lot more kind of data retrieval systems and like cloud systems that would actually back that up. But in the 1990s, you imagine doing that in something like a financial institution with a global reach, it would completely unravel society. So Brad Pitt, like as the unrepressed, unfettered version of Edward Norton that can do what he can't, he kind of actually says like, well, we're going to pursue this, and it doesn't matter what the cost. I'm going to be the anti-hero. I'm going to actually throw off, society's hold on me, and I'm actually going to reset the clocks and reset it and return us to that primal state where we can be our true selves, not this kind of thing which actually society has molded us into, us men. And what's interesting is actually Edward Norton ends up being in conflict with himself. Like, as an agent of chaos, he ironically becomes the fulfillment of his ideology, like that chaotic evil, but also that chaotic neutral. Like, he's fighting himself and he can't, like, I'm about this, but I'm not willing to pursue those ends. So he tries to actually undermine Brad Pitt's efforts, ironically trying to undo what he himself has done, but he's not privy to what Brad Pitt has done, what his schizophrenic self has done. He's trying to actually guess at strings, like, and say, like, it's this, or maybe he's done that, like, and he tries to actually undo that kind of bombing exercise of this anarchist organization, and he can't, because he's not privy to actually what's happened and what's actually occurred. But I just remember, like, it reminds me a lot of a friend I had in Laidlaw College. I don't think Caleb ever had the privilege of meeting him, but he was a guy who basically came to Christ from the gang culture in New Zealand. He would never be seen without a leather jacket. He was doing his, he loved to find gospel parallels and things like Black Sabbath and like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. Like, basically his thesis and doctoral thesis he wanted to pursue was this idea of Christ as the first anarchist. And so he wanted to pursue this idea that actually, like, he was a lived example of what he actually believed. Like, actually, the most basic form of actually our society would be best served and best actually done if we would return to, like, kind of those base kind of tribal communities, those village settings where actually the only law we have is to ourselves, and actually the great royal law, you know, love God with your everything and love your neighbor as yourself, right? There's, like, we would actually live better if we actually truncated it all down to those simple things, lived in smaller communities, and actually we're not answerable to institutions and to religions and to laws. Like, we actually were that law unto ourselves. Like, he was kind of seeking to redefine what anarchy in its popularized sense meant, and actually say Christ was actually trying to show the true anarchistic way, unlike what had actually been seen, and to actually revolt against the institutions to establish his kingdom, which in a way was kind of no kingdom at the same time. And I have to admit, go on.
Oh, sorry. What was that? Just to interject, was that more along the lines of a voluntaristic anarchy that he was proposing?
I think he was of the mind that actually society would be best if, like, yes, it is voluntary, but actually we would all actually return to this more simplistic, minimalistic way of living. But yeah, like, the irony, the tension, the paradox is actually he acknowledges that actually it would have to be voluntary. It would have to be by volition and by your own will. Like, you can't force that on someone necessarily, which by contrast, that's actually, Brad Pitt in Fight Clubs, that's his conclusion. Like, no, it has to be actually, the choice has to be taken away. It has to actually be reset for people. I just wondered what your thoughts were around, both of you, this idea of maybe Christ as the first anarchist and actually society being reset to a more minimalistic way of doing things.
I will just pause there for a second because I really need to blow my nose.
I will just pause there for a second because I'm going to close the door. Hold that thought. Do you need to pee break, Andy?
I'm good, man.
So we're at risk of going on a little bit longer at this stage. What's your feel? Do you want to call it at 9:30, or do you want to keep going? Or
I don't mind either way, whatever feels natural. Do you want to do another round and do 2 movies each, or are you wanting to do just the one?
It's a good call. Andrew just posted the question, Caleb, like, do we want to do, say, 2 movies each? 2 or 3? 2 movies each.
2 or 3. We should really gather these movies, you know what I mean?
I'm done. I was thinking, based on the time, we probably should limit it to the one. I only had 2 anyway.
Yeah.
The other was 4. Eyes Wide Shut.
You mean?
Wow.
Yeah. Do you mean the one that we've just done, or one more after this? What's your thinking?
the one that we've just done.
Okay.
Unless we can do like a 5-minute talk, and I don't think I could do that on Eyes Wide Shut, even though I haven't seen it in ages. It's just
Oh man, sorry, I missed that reference before. Yeah, Eyes Wide Shut is such a good one to do as well. Oh man.
Yeah.
I've never seen it.
Yeah.
I've heard some things though.
Watch it and then look up the conspiracy theories related to it.
You thinking like Bohemian Grove and like Masonic Lodge, that kind of stuff?
Similar kind of stuff.
Yeah.
This movie potentially got Stanley Kubrick killed.
Get out, really?
We should have a chat about that one afterwards in private or something.
Yeah.
We will.
Yeah.
We will.
Yeah. Well, what we could do as well, if we're keen to actually do something like this again, we could talk about more movies after this. We've each done one. What's your feel on that? What's your thoughts?
I'd be open to it. I feel like I could really. I almost want to watch Hacksaw Ridge and make some notes because I loved that movie the first time I watched it.
Yeah, I love it too.
My other movies were The King's Speech.
Okay, I've never seen it.
Great film.
And and the other one was actually a Netflix TV series called Alice in Borderland, which
I haven't seen it.
I'd be very surprised if either of you have seen it. That's why I wasn't sold on it, because it would be so unpopular, no one would have heard of it.
No, but I like that for this reason. Like, as one, like, we'll get actually an opportunity. It's like, oh, I'm going to go watch that. But two, like, you can imagine an average listener listening to this and being like, oh, I didn't know about that. I'll check that out. It's kind of,
Another one that I considered, and for probably obvious reasons, if you've seen it, I think you have, Jared. Don John.
That's a great film as well.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
I could imagine that conversation getting pretty out of control.
Like, no, it's funny. Like, I mean, probably similar to Eyes Wide Shut as well. Like what they arrive at with Don John is kind of like a rediscovery of a Christian ethic of love. Like, yes, this is a guy like who was like a pornography addict and like typical of so many guys in our generation, right? Like, all of us, like myself included, at different stages of my life, right? And I think like there's a real invitation to, at the end, you discover, that's meaningless. That's not actually all that like physical intimacy is about. Like, I find it so interesting, like a non-Christian work, a secular work, arrives at a deeper understanding, an appeal to the greater meaning of what love is and physical intimacy in the context of that. Have you seen that, Caleb? Great film.
Haven't seen it.
Joseph Gordon-Levitt?
Yep.
He's the main dude in it. Like, great film.
Has Steph seen it?
Yeah, I think we watched it together. Yeah, funnily enough.
Yeah, me and Erica watched it, and I was like, sorry, babe.
It was a bit like that. Yeah.
Like, I swear I love you. It's like, but yeah, no, I'm more than open to another conversation about the stuff, because there's so many movies out there.
Oh yeah, like let's. I want to get your thoughts on actually what you think about Christian anarchy, as my friend would have pitched it. But yeah, like if you're both open to it, let's pause the other movies and the other conversations, and we can pick that up at another time.
Okay. So Christ the First Anarchist.
Yeah. What do you think of Christ as the First Anarchist, guys?
I love it.
You love it.
He so was, right? So if we put him back in the historical moment of time that he really was an anarchist. Like, he was doing things that even his own people, had no idea what he was doing. It was chaotic. It was ridiculous. It was blasphemous, right? It was unlike anything that any of his own people had any thought of. Like, he was run out of towns and stuff. Like, it was nuts. If you look at when he went into the temple, even for a first example, and he went and made a whip. He didn't just grab a whip that was on a table. He saw what was going on. He turned around. He thought about it. He went and made a whip to combat this. It was entirely anti-society.
Anti-establishment, Yeah, that always strikes me about that story is like, to make a cat of nine tails. That's quite methodic. Like, it's not a like impassioned, Jesus kind of turned over the temple and everything and like in a fit of passion, like to actually go and make that whip would have taken time and pre-consideration, wouldn't it? Even as a prophetic protest. Yeah.
Potential. Was it a cat of nine tails? Because does it use the language of did he scourge those in the temple?
It's a good question.
I think it uses the phrase, I think it calls it a rope, but historically I think it refers to a whip type object, not so much a tool of destruction or torture.
Where's our boy Michael Heiser with like the original Greek, right?
Also, just to, I think I misspoke before. I didn't mean he was run out of towns. I mean he was unwelcome in towns,
especially his own hometown.
Specifically,
Often the sign of a prophet. He, in terms of what you're saying, Andrew, about him being an anarchist, how would you define anarchist in that regard?
Yeah. I'd say probably less impulsively than my outburst inferred, but anarchist to the point of being anti the established government, societal regulations, common norms, things that were counter to the commonplace normal way of being. To a vast degree, like to a very extreme degree.
Yeah, Dr. Google says a state of disorder due to absence or non-recognition of authority or other controlling systems.
Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that I would agree to a certain extent that he was definitely anti the current establishment of, I guess, the societal status quo and even in some cases the religious one. But he also affirmed the religion of the religious leaders. And he didn't necessarily want to destroy it but fulfill it. There were certain parts of it that he did want to replace and therefore remove and potentially destroy. Prophesied the destruction of the temple, which was very central to the faith. But and I'm not necessarily challenging you because I'm not implying that you are saying this, but it definitely wasn't chaotic in the way that there wasn't order. I think it was obviously very deliberate. Everything that Christ did, has done, is doing now, and will do is very meticulous and planned, and that's why. On a slightly related note, I hate the song "Reckless Love." I think it has God's love is not reckless in the slightest. I understand where it's coming from, but I believe God's love is meticulous and ordered.
That doesn't fit in with the rhythm of the song, man.
No, it doesn't. But
no, you raise a good point, though, Caleb. That's
I thought you were going to say
actually
Jared.
spot on. No. No, I think you're right. I probably shouldn't have said chaotic. I don't even know if anarchy is really the right word either, to be honest, because you're correct, and you say that he was methodical and he was planned, and he made decisions deliberately. It wasn't on a whim. Nothing he ever did was on a whim. But I would say that the perception people would have had of him at the time would have been quite the contrary. Like imagine being one of the rabbis in the, in the temple, and then this guy walks in saying, you've turned my house into a brood of vipers, and he, starts whipping and overturning tables. Like that would have been perceived very differently than the spirit in which it was delivered.
Yes.
So there's that sort of juxtaposition as to what he did and why versus how it was perceived and how, and why that was happening.
Yeah, which is why I asked that question. I just wanted to clarify and I do agree there was a level of chaos to that, especially perceived chaos, like you say, from the perspective of the rabbis and the people who had devoted their lives to this liturgy that they thought was to be never changing, for some of them at least.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you asked though, because it's the the ability to clarify is actually something that is so valuable. And I wish more people were given the opportunity to clarify if they've not delivered something the way they should have.
Yeah.
Case in point, Jesus.
Yeah. Well, like, I mean, I quite like both of your clarifications, especially based on that first definition I gave, like a state of disorder due to absence or non-recognition of authority or other controlling systems. Like, one of the points of contention that my friend often found by joining anarchist societies and proposing what was the intended subject of his thesis was that, you know, people are saying, but you're advocating religion. If Jesus is the true anarchist, then you're advocating the following of his way. That's just another authority, and that's just another controlling system. But like the second definition here offered is like this idea of absence of government and absolute freedom of the individual regarded as a political ideal. And I think his suggestion was like the absolute freedom of the individual is like, there's that Ephesians verse, right? It was for freedom that you have been made free, right? Like, it was for freedom.
Yeah.
You know, that's why we were saved. We're now free as slaves to Christ, which sounds on the surface like a paradox, but it's like you're slaves to righteousness. Although you're in our sinful nature, our converted nature, there's this idea that actually you are subject to just your passions and your desires. But suddenly when you're saved, it's like, oh, I actually have an option here between doing what is right and doing what is wrong. And I can perceive those two differences. So like there's this recognition of Jesus is the anarchist, but he's also in the way that he was perceived and the way that he actually went about doing things seems to be an advocation of like smaller base communities, people being in intimacy with one another and truly knowing each other. I forget the guy, but there was some theologian or writer popularized the idea of Jesus's model of concentric circle of known peoples and friends, like the 500 and then the 70 and then the 12 and then the 3. Like, we will probably in our lives only know about 500 people on a consistent basis, right? And that those 500 may change from place to place to place, but that's kind of a mode of doing life. And maybe Jesus is modeling a better way that in terms of those base communities. But the government is not absent in Jesus's perceived ideals, because it's like the Gospel of John. He's speaking to the Pharisees and it's like, you talk about what you do not know, but I am a witness of what I have seen. So it's not like he's trying to establish a governance that is countercultural and otherworldly, like his kingdom, God's kingdom. And so like the absolute freedom of the individual is freedom to obey the two royal laws: love God with everything, love your neighbor as you would love yourself, right? Like freedom to actually be able to do that in essence and in pragmatism. But then, yeah, I do wonder, it's like, that's a better way of living, but it's also, is it true anarchy, I guess, is part of the reason or part of the thinking.
I guess in more modern history, I guess an allegory we could use for what we perceive to be your friend's model of anarchy, it's potentially relative anarchy, because I can imagine back in the 18th century with the American Revolution to the British Empire, what the Americans were proposing, I'm sure, seemed like anarchy to them, because it was very freeing to the people of the people of America, that they were self-governing and that they didn't have this strict monarchy. I'm sure by contrast it was somewhat anarchistic, and I have a friend who has some similar views to what you've been talking about, Jared, and he would refer to it as that there is, in his view of anarchy, there is still a form of, I guess what one would call government. It's just that what we see as government now is more far-reaching than what that would be, that we wouldn't even consider that model of government to be a government.
Would it be more like your friend would probably advocate for democratic, self-governing communities? Like,
not even that.
not even that.
He doesn't support democracy in the slightest.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So yeah. And I may be inviting him on
oh, cool.
for future episodes, by the way.
Love that.
Yeah, because he has some good things to talk about.
What do you think about the film, like either of you, like in terms of actually conceptualizing anarchy? And I mean, it's like with any good piece of cinema or film, like there's some good and there's some bad, and it takes some time and discernment to dissect what is good and bad about it, right? But what's your thoughts? Like,
it's an interesting film. It's been some years since I've seen it. I would say it is quite heavy on the anarchy, especially the ending with the, like, heavy spoilers, but like, you know, the attempted suicide and everything, like while out looking at the work that's being accomplished while it's happening, and we're in full spoiler territory. So like as the bombs are exploding and he's shooting himself and it's all going on, it's almost as though his goal wasn't simply to live in the new world that he was trying to create. It was just to get to that point, and then it doesn't matter. You know, like he got to the point where he was shooting himself while it was all going on, right? Like he didn't even seem to want to live in the new world he was creating. Which begs the question, was he doing it selflessly for other people, or was he doing it just out of, was it essentially hate crimes, just wanting to tear establishment down? His motives never truly explored.
Well, maybe it was like wanting to actually have freedom within himself. Like it's the first time he stood up to himself and said, you know, no, I want this. You aren't going to be the master of my soul, basically, the master of my fate.
Yeah.
I'll dictate it for myself.
Maybe. So are you proposing that the sort of suicide by shooting, all that sort of like him and himself simultaneously kind of thing, was a attempted escape from that?
Yeah, like it's a kind of resolution, isn't it? Because up until that point, he's been dictated by, you know, Brad Pitt has been, I'm just using the names of the actors interchangeably to demonstrate the point, right? But up until that point, Brad Pitt has dictated to Edward Norton, these are the decisions you're going to make, and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. And that's not true anarchy, is it? Although like it's been a kind of a model
control.
of freedom. Yeah, it's control, exactly. So like he becomes this agent of chaos, but he's actually in another form of entrapment when he is, you know, by this split personality taking cues from him. And so when he actually kills himself or attempts to kill himself, that's like when he's actually saying, well, I'm not going to be dictated to you anymore. In fact, that is resolution psychologically within myself, because I'm telling you like who's in control. It's not the persona, it's the more genuine me. Whatever that is.
I think in some cases as well, I guess in one case it may potentially even be just a fear of the consequences of what he realizes he or Tyler has just done. That
true. Tyler, that's his name.
It's an escape from oh my goodness, I can't believe that this was me that did it. I feel so guilty and fearful of what could happen after that. I'm just going to stop this from happening again, because hey, he could blow up another building or many more. That's a possibility. Just for the motives behind the attempted suicide.
What's interesting that there's... Oh, go on, Andrew.
just a super quick question, Jared.
Yeah.
Has been some years since I've seen it, but his suicide, do you remember it being to die, or was it to kill Tyler? Because I know that when he does it, it's actually Tyler that dies, but he survives. Or Brad Pitt that dies, but Edward Norton survives, yeah?
The take I had on it was like he actually was trying to kill himself and he botched it.
Right, okay.
Like that's my take on it.
Right, okay.
But it did
I was
succeed.
almost wondering. Yeah. I was almost wondering if it was an attempt to kill Tyler but not himself. Then at the end, it almost is a victory against an evil side of yourself, right? Like, kill the bad.
Yeah. Well, I find it interesting, like Helena Bonham Carter and that as well. Like there's a subplot with the whole, it's like, and this is a parallel to a Christian ideal, I think, as well. It's like the love of that person, of Tyler, that actually anchors him and actually brings those disassociated versions of himself back to a core. Like, no, you are this. You might think you're this and you might think you're that, but you're actually, I have a relationship with Tyler. Like in the book, it actually explains that better, and like there's the ambiguity and the confusion and the frustration that the character played by Helena Bonham Carter explains. Like she's like, what the F are you doing? Like, you told me this, you were here, now you're there, like what's going on? Like, because part of the motivation is also not just the disembodied thousands who will be affected by the bombing, but there's also a personal face. Like actually, I want to save the person I love, and so that kind of anchors like that sense of self. It's interesting, that idea as well. Like the passion of that drives him enough to actually say, I'm going to actually fight against this other version of myself that up until this point I've been kind of happily to be in the back seat and let take the lead and let actually dictate my course and my actions for me. And it takes like that extreme peril to actually motivate him to do something. Yeah, I think there's an appeal to that, like love your neighbor as yourself as well idea again. Like it's possibly. I just love this idea. Like I remember reading Wild at Heart. Have either of you read that by John Eldridge?
No.
Eldridge. But as a young man, and I think like the book covers this, the movie covers this, in an age where there could be arguably said to be a crisis of masculinity. I read Wild at Heart, and I feel like, yeah, this is a real advocation of what is biblical masculinity, and it's like I love what this is presenting as a better way of actually doing what it means to be a man, and without all the caricatures and the gender stereotypes. Actually, let's go back to the text and see what it says about what it means to be man, and framing that Christologically. Like, let's look at Christ as the ideal man of what we should strive to be, but not in a kind of like, again, not in a stereotypical or in a caricature way, but in actually a studied, reasonable, freeing sort of way, I would say. And I think like there's aspects of this film which appeal to that as well. Like and I like the the book appeals to this as well. Like the dangerous, risky sides of men are also the sides that enable men to take great risks, selfless risks on behalf of others, or to actually to do things that could be viewed by some as stupid, but others as courageous, and like to actually do the things that actually, great risk, great reward, actually accomplish great feats and great successes. That's something intrinsic to the essence of masculinity, which actually ought to be rediscovered and ought to be venerated in terms of virtue. But I mean, this is pretty divisive and politically charged ideas that I'm espousing in our time and age. Maybe just as like before we do a bit of a wrap up, did you have any thoughts on that idea? Obviously, let's not go bomb buildings. Like, that's not an example of true masculinity. But
just
but
briefly,
maybe punching each other.
Yes, amen.
Just once or twice, or 2 or 3 times.
I actually think I think guys should actually like scrap it out a bit more. Like, like, why do you think like a lot of guys do martial arts as a discipline or as a hobby? Like, there's a controlled form to actually, those testosterone, those hormonal urges, like you're giving discipline, you're giving order to the chaotic self. I don't think that's actually inherently a bad thing.
It's
And
not.
I'm not fully formed enough to say like, yes, this is definitely the truth. I'm just proposing an idea and seeing what your thoughts are on it.
Go, Caleb.
I think that's a discussion for another time. I think that's a discussion for another time.
Okay, fair point. But what about in relation to the movie? Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you think there's wholesome aspects and there's like, these are the parts that are unwholesome? Say like solidarity with other men, that's seen in the film.
Yeah, I mean, other than the circumstance in which it takes form, there's certainly almost a humility to it. Like there's that, like, love each other with brotherly affection. And while it is a violent sport and activity that they're undertaking, it's something that they're all in together, and it's just theirs. Like, it's not something that they spread and they don't share, like they do with invite only kind of thing. But like for the sake of that group, it's precious almost. And while it's probably dangerous and unhealthy to a point, there's actually some wholesome stuff in there. And especially, I mean, it's maybe even more relevant today in 2020. There's a need for that comradeship, that where there's a thing that you share with your closest people, and it's really important because it's actually something that you can be grounded in, and out of it can come really good, healthy relationships, which are so vital, like really, really vital. I'm not saying go start a fight club, but maybe it is time for a resurgence of healthy groups of people to unite with something that they can really have each other's backs in, and but I mean, this could go into a whole nother discussion. So it's almost gang culture.
True.
But isn't that almost what churches should be?
Yes.
Big time.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
here's my argument is that in the book of Acts and stuff, right, it describes the early church as small groups, right? There were small groups planted around, and then they would come together and congregate, congregation, and that's where they would have corporate worship and teachings. But then they would have their small groups, and that was the day-to-day real life stuff. That was the in the thick of it, in the trenches with your boys. And now it's the opposite, where we have these massive churches with like no relationship in it.
Yes.
But then out of that, there's the ideal little, go to your house church once every second Wednesday or whatever. But it's almost the opposite of how it started. It's like these are done out of obligation almost. They're good. I'm not saying they're not good. They're very, very good. But it almost appears as though it's an obligation versus the necessity that it was at the start.
Yeah, and I think also maybe something that is I guess a good thing to take out of the film is the fact that they saw evils in their own society, just the worship of meaningless material gain for the sake of nothing, and they were rising up against that now in a very terroristic and violent manner that I do not condone, but you can see why they did that, because they were bored of the society that they lived in, that they were sick of it. They felt like there was no escape except through means of violence, and that's what a lot of people do in modern society is they turn to terror groups or terroristic actions. Closer to home in New Zealand, for example, the shootings that happened in Christchurch in March last year, the manifesto that was written in it, Brenton Tarrant, the shooter, he wrote he was talking about how he had seen so many horrible things happening in the world, and he kept on saying to himself, why won't somebody do something? Why won't somebody do something? And then I realized, why don't I do something? And now I do not agree with his views on pretty much anything. I see what brought him to that, because he was saying, why won't anybody do anything? Just as these men in the Fight Club film were saying, why won't anybody do anything? We know what to do. Let's do it. Let's make a change to our society. It was not a good change. It was not done by good means, but it was driven by a desire to escape the evils that oppressed and held them back. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so good, both of you. Like, I think, I mean, that's probably a good point to close on. But just I think, like, we definitely see this in, I think, Jesus's mode of actually doing his ministry in the 3 years, right? He, had those 500 he's connected by, the 500 witnesses who saw him post-resurrection, and the 70 he sent out, and the 12 disciples he did most of his ministry with, and the 3 he felt closest enough to actually call his best friends, essentially, right? Like, but even within that, there's like a group of people that are organized around a sense of purpose and a sense of missional living about, we are committed to what we are doing to, as Jesus would put it, promote God's kingdom, to show actually what relationship with God is supposed to look like. And so, yeah, like there's a returning back to, these guys weren't just like, as I think, they weren't like what we see how churches got it wrong these days, in terms of we go to a service once a week where we are given, like what we're supposed to get for the week, and there's a kind of like a consumerist mentality. But actually, like in terms of the Greek, the ecclesia, the body of the faithful, right? Like, it's the gathering, it's in the coming together, and it's actually, I mean, there's so much I think the Gospels don't talk about the day-to-day of doing life with Jesus, and the day-to-day of actually traveling from this destination, getting annoyed with each other on the road, and like, actually rubbing shoulders, having great times of camaraderie, but also times of frustration, and like, like the mundane, like, I think Zechariah calls it the day of small, not despising the day of small things, right? But that's all part of it. Because I think like life is made up of a lot of little small moments that make up the sum of the whole, right? But yeah, I think like there's definitely more we could talk about, gentlemen, and I think all of us are kind of feeling we would like to continue this conversation, but maybe in a follow-up cast and in a follow-up conversation. Any closing thoughts from each of you before we actually wrap up?
I have one last thing to say.
Do it, man.
Just as maybe a bit of a buffer to what we were talking about with that last point, which was quite heavy about comradeship and all that sort of thing, especially with Fight Club. There are 2 verses that I'm reminded of that I think would just be really nice to inject into that. First will be Romans 14:19 that I'm thinking of, and it's just, so then let us pursue what is for peace and mutual upbuilding. The comradeship and everything's great, but put it to a good purpose. Don't put it to violence.
Where does it lead? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So get it, and then what do you do with it?
Yes.
The second would be 2 Thessalonians 3:13, which is super short, but it's just, as for you, brothers, do not grow weary in doing good. And I just keep it in there, man. Especially when we're talking about comradeship and brotherly unity and all that. Just do good, bro.
Yeah, man.
But that was all from me.
Yeah.
Cool.
Caleb?
No, I mean, I think you guys have, in those closing thoughts, covered it quite well. I guess, yeah, I think on that, we'll probably close up and say to all you 2s and 3s out there, thanks for watching or listening, and come back next time as we discuss the intricacies of the cinematic masterpiece that is Shrek the Third.
Sorry, straight face. Shrek the Third. Yes. Please guys, check out in the links below. We'll link some content that you can actually further, if you're interested, research, say some of the topics we've actually talked about and tried to cover. Definitely be plugging IMDb a couple of times, I imagine. But I also encourage Christians as well, be engaged with popular culture. I think that's kind of a side point, but there's actually a lot of things that we can actually take to point back to the Christian worldview. We can actually take an opportunity to actually say, hey, these are things that actually affirm what Christ actually affirmed also. These are things that don't agree, but let's show you actually how they do agree. And I feel like in the role of evangelism and the role of an apologist, part of our role should be actually to reach our unsaved peoples, the peoples that actually want to communicate the message of the gospel in meaningful ways. We should try to find that point of continuity. We should try to find those points of commonality of where we can actually say, hey, this is where Christ is for life and for truth and for good, and let's actually show those ways. And pop culture can definitely be one of those ways we do it. So yeah, guys, thanks again for listening. Been an absolute pleasure to have, as always, my beautiful co-host Caleb, and the wise, the insightful, the enjoyable Andrew. Did you enjoy coming on, man?
Loved it.
Awesome, bro. Bless you guys. Thanks for coming on, and see you again.
See ya.